Hello, I'm mischievous Mark Giannacchio, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man and Amazing Fantasy number 15 and all of the Amazing Spider-Man annuals, which, of all of the comics I own, those are the ones I say do not count.
And I'm Dapper Dan Gavazdan. I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals. I have even some comics from Transylvania. I mean, imagine that. And they count as well. But for me, Amazing Fantasy 15 remains a fantasy.
Wow, much like Transylvania is a fantasy. Well, welcome to the Amazing Spider Talk, the show where two fans and collectors uncover the strange, fun, and fascinating history of the Spider-Man comic universe. Dan, I know you're thinking, Transylvania's a real place. Why did he say that? Anyway, thanks for joining us for this review episode of the Amazing Spider Talk.
Yeah, this isn't like Krakoa or Begalia or any of those places that are made up.
Sure. Anyway, keep going.
Okay. Why didn't I go with Wakanda? I don't know. Anyway, if you want to swing along with us on our journey through Spidey's past, present, and future, subscribe to Amazing Spider Talk on your favorite podcast app and leave us a review to help spread the word about our show, Latveria. See, I'm just going to keep adding in fictional countries here.
There you go. This podcast exists because of the support of our Patreon members. If you want to receive early episodes, exclusive artwork, and keep this podcast going, go to AmazingSpiderTalk.com and consider joining our Patreon.
Today on the show, Mark and I are going to be discussing Amazing Spider-Man Volume 6, number 49. This issue is written by Zeb Wells. The cover and interiors feature artwork by John Romita Jr., inks by Scott Hanna, and colors by Marcio Menyz. And of course, letters by VC's Joe Caramanga. This issue was first released on May 8th, 2024. Well, Mark, we've seen several tie-ins to larger events going on at Marvel reflected in the pages of Amazing Spider-Man throughout this run with a real range and quality. I think you and I declared that the excellent Judgment Day story was one of the best tie-in stories Amazing Spider-Man had ever seen to an event. But then you get something terrible like the death of Kamala Khan, as ordered by Daddy Feige, apparently. How are you saying Feige these days, Mark?
I was listening again to the podcast that we did as like our aftermath podcast, and I said it about 11 different ways on that show. So, you pick a pronunciation and we'll go with it, okay?
All right. Well, we'll do that. But with this issue directly tying into Blood Hunt, how do you think this issue works as a connection to that event and as an issue of Amazing Spider-Man?
I haven't read Blood Hunt 1 yet. I have it, but I haven't picked it. I haven't read through it yet. Much like Judgment Day, I thought this was pretty effective, as a use of the status quo. I mean, obviously there was nothing preceding this comic book that would, lead us to Spider-Man fighting vampires out of nowhere. So in terms of transitioning into that status quo, it works seamlessly, and it told an effective Spider-Man story. Putting aside the execution on the Kamala Khan story, I think something we could safely say after certainly this issue and the Judgment Day issue, and even like how he took the orders from Kevin Feige. Maybe he didn't take it was a collective order, right? From
now you're doing it intentionally. I have to imagine you're doing this intentionally.
Anyway, what I'm trying to say is I think Zeb Wells is a really good team player when it comes to these events. I think more so than we've seen in the past with Dan Slott or Nick Spencer. I mean, really, those are kind of some of the folks that come to mind in terms of like having to kind of ham fist these events into the pages of Amazing Spider-Man. Zeb Wells does it better than anyone else that I've seen. I mean, going back to probably like the 80s and early 90s. With all that said, I mean, and I kind of hinted this opinion to you over text, but like, we're kind of like, this is the base level of what a Spider-Man story should be. And like, I'm not saying that doesn't make it not good. It's very good, but like, I mean, I don't want to go crazy praising the fact that like we had a status quo that was kind of thrusted upon Zeb here, and he did a good job just telling a very straightforward Spider-Man story through it. But maybe I'm being a little cynical here. What did you think in terms of how he tied everything together here?
I mean, I think to really talk about like that, it means getting into like the kind of arc of the comic itself. I think the real artistry here comes in the kind of like one-shot nature of this and the utilization of Spider-Man that makes it special as part of the story. I have read Blood Hunt, and I thought it was a fine first issue of that event series. I think the timing of all this has been pretty good in regards to Spider-Man. He doesn't really have a role to play in Blood Hunt, but he did have a role to play in the free comic book day that set up Blood Hunt, where he's one of the first to kind of encounter the inciting incident of Blood Hunt, which is basically like the dark dimension being unleashed all over the planet, and in a way to block out the sun and let the vampires were under whoever's rule run free. They're implying it's Dracula, but I'm not quite sure that that's true. But anyway, I think, you know, Spider-Man is going to play a very minor role in that event, but I think the way he's utilized here is really smart. The idea that like he's going to give us a little bit of a street level view, but mostly he's going to be used to humanize the villains, which like is kind of Spider-Man's bread and butter. Like where this kind of falters as a Amazing Spider-Man issue for me is that the ending of it just suddenly becomes like a ad for a tie-in miniseries. And that can feel very unsatisfying, especially to like move on to Amazing Spider-Man 50, which we know is going to be the Spider-Goblin story. And I imagine is not going to really deal with the impacts of whatever happens in Blood Hunt, down the line. But I also can acknowledge why that's the case. Like, they couldn't start this story earlier because, Blood Hunt hadn't kicked off yet. Yeah. And they couldn't do it later because they've got this big story ready for issue 50, which maybe means they're more beholden to the numbers of the issues than they are to the stories being told within. But I got to be honest, I thought this worked really solidly as like a one-shot. Like if it didn't have that tease at the end, I would have been like totally cool with this as a little story that nods at the rest of the Marvel Universe and let Spider-Man have a little adventure in something bigger overall. So for me, I thought it did mostly an excellent job weighing both tying into an event and being a normal issue of Amazing Spider-Man, as you were perhaps suggesting.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the timing, because I even feel that, I know that the Chasm issues had some connections in terms of like the human brain and stuff like that, but like this book has been in a weird space for a few months now, I feel like. So yeah. It is a little, they're definitely more concentrated on the 5-0 that's upcoming and trying to do something big and bad for that instead of just like telling the story they need to tell. With that said, like, yeah, I mean this certainly works as like a one and done in the frame of reference. And yeah, like I was almost kind of disappointed that the way it ended, it was like, now I got to find the conclusion in this other one shot. I mean, like, usually I feel like it's been either like the one shot or the issue within the Amazing Spider-Man. It's not usually, but whatever.
I mean, this is part of the like Nick Lowe tenure thing, which is like there are constantly books that operate within the main story of Amazing Spider-Man that are being moved to other books. I'm thinking about like Sinister War or the like point ones in Hunted. I'm sure there's a bunch that I'm forgetting. Remember the whole like chameleon conspiracy? I tried to forget that story, but there was like the multiple king-sized King's Ransom. Like we even covered them on here. Like, do we cover Amazing Spider-Man Blood Hunt? I don't think so. Like we've seen like tie-ins to events, have their own thing all the way back to like, I'm thinking like Amazing Spider-Man Siege or, stuff like that, where it's like, look, you could read that, but it's not going to be that important. Right. He had a whole relationship with Miss Marvel that was never appeared in the pages of Amazing Spider-Man, but was only in those B titles. So, I mean, I don't think that this is a great sin or anything. Not enough to like spawn kindred to chase after someone and not tell them what their sin is for 75 issues. But like
you're playing the hits right now, Dan.
I am. Yeah. So I don't know. I thought it was totally acceptable and not outside of the realm of like Amazing Spider-Man conventions, you know, of the past 20, 25 years of publishing. So a bummer for a story that feels so complete to go, it's suddenly not complete.
Right.
But I really am not bothered by it. It truly feels like a, hey, if you like this story, you can get more. And if you didn't, don't bother. Like, and I may be wrong. Blood Hunt may end up becoming super important for people who want to know the Lizard status quo, and God help those people. But yeah. So anyway, let's talk about the story itself. Because to me, this is where the artistry really came in. Like, I think you're right. This is like a kind of like, and we've been saying this for maybe the past year or so, like since Dead Language, short of maybe the end of Gang War, which is like a lot of these issues have been just kind of generic Spider-Man stories, or like solid Spider-Man stories that like used to be kind of the average of like runs past. This particular story reminds me a lot of what I consider a great story from DeFalco and Friends in the sensational Spider-Man Self-Improvement from a few years back. And again, at the end of this, I keep asking myself, like, why isn't this the tone of the entire run? Like the monologuing, the low stakes, the character-oriented storytelling. Like, this is Amazing to me, this is what Amazing Spider-Man should be. And Zeb gets here so frequently and infrequently that it makes you really wonder, like, why is there such variance on these books?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like when there isn't it's so weird that, because I feel like we saw this with Judgment Day too. Like, when there isn't the pressure to tell a larger Spider-Man story, like Zeb is just able to like tell a Spider-Man story, you know, the way it should be told. It's funny to me. It's like this infatuation, and I don't even know if it's necessarily endemic of this editorial. I think this is frankly something that we've been seeing for decades now, but it's like this infatuation, like, you know, like every Spider-Man, like every multi-part Spider-Man story has to, you know, it's got to be big, you know, like it's always going to be like the next big thing. And I think like these are the stories that end up losing the thread of what makes a Spider-Man story a unique Spider-Man story. In that, like, at the end of the day, why does this specific comic work? Because it's so deeply entrenched in Peter's brain. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like this is all about Peter, and you know, like, yes, the crisis within the story is White Rabbit's been turned, and Peter's got to save her, and she's the one in trouble, but it's not her story. This is Peter, kind of having an arc from, well, hey, you know, I'm starting out, and this is like, you know, no muss, no fuss, avenging here. And then all of a sudden it becomes very real with very high stakes to him because he realizes there's like people behind the fangs, if you will. And like, it's like, it kind of bewilders me that we're able to tell a Peter story better in the context of an event tie-in, because I feel like the event tie-ins we've seen over the course of this current run have very clearly, you know, putting aside the other one shot with the lizard here, have clearly like been set up as being self-contained stories. It's like when the pressure is off to have to tell a bigger Spider-Man story, we seem to be able to follow the bouncing ball better, which is just an interesting phenomenon for me. I mean, am I off base with this, or do you see where I'm going at here?
No, I've thought the same exact thing. Although I will say I do think both this and the Judgment Day issue still do a good job of tying back into the larger story that Zeb is telling, or at least engaging on the threads he set up. Like Judgment Day really was about like Peter trusting Norman, and like, did Peter have an imagination that Gwen would approve of that? You know, And this one too is about, you know, an updated like kind of follow up on Gang War, which is like, it's really playing off the empathy that Peter has for these villains and the people that they are, and his willingness to like go to bat and help them, then coming back and having repercussions. You know, this is the Tombstone story in a microcosm, which is like, he spared Tombstone at the end of, you know, World Without Love, and now, you know, Tombstone is going to ostensibly, it seems, try to kill Spider-Man and probably harm New York City in the process. So, you know, I don't think they're completely devoid of tying in, but it does seem like, you're right, there's some feeling of the pressure being off, which I don't want to discount a lot of the great stories in this run. I mean, we got that great Vulture 2-parter, the Hobgoblin 3-parter, the, you know, Dr. Octopus where Spider-Man put on his arms. I think the Ravencroft story we just got was a lot of fun. I mean, I think there have been a lot of 2 or 3 or 1-part stories that have done really well. It's the big 6-part stories, for the most part, where this run falls apart, you know, excluding the opening story, which I thought was really excellent.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we're looking at Dead Languages and Gang War as being the problematic stories of this run so far, and I think both of those kind of fit the bill of what I was describing as like, we have to tell this larger Spider-Man story right now and bring in all these other elements. You know, with Gang War, it was Madame Mask and all these other elements, and certainly with Dead Languages, we you know, we've beaten that to death in terms of no pun intended, in terms of what was drawn into that, and again, like, what was the common denominator in all those stories is we lost the thread of Peter. When this creative team is focusing on Peter, we're in good shape. And it's funny, like, I wanted to kind of pick at what you said there with this and the connection to Tombstone and even, like, you know, World Without Love and stuff like that, because, like, you know, something that struck me as I was reading this is like, this is now what, like the 3rd or 4th time where Spider-Man has where Spider-Man has aligned with these characters and within Tombstone's gang, and he's been burned by it. And I think that's like a really interesting thematic repetition that's developing here. And I think it's going to, frankly, set the stage for whatever this Tombstone story is to come that we're allegedly going to get later this year. I think there's clearly, you know, a fool me once, shame on me, fool me, you know, or whatever kind of thing going on here. And I'm curious to see how that all ties together at the end, because I think it's going to.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, like, you know, I think a lot of this run, for all its ups and downs, will be defined by the way it ends. You know, I think the same way the Spencer run was defined by the way it ends, you know, like, which is to say, so much was like, you know, I think this has been more enjoyable as a read throughout. Like, it is interspersed with what I think are really good Spider-Man stories, whereas Spencer's was really relying on that end. But I think there's so much that can be redeemed here about some of the failures of the bigger stories if they're in service of something coming down the line. We'll see, and I'm going to reserve my judgment until then. I'm about to say something, Mark, that I think a lot of people who listen to our show regularly are going to be surprised by, which is this book is ostensibly in like what I think is a somewhat major and minor way about Spider-Man's kill code, and I liked it. I have bemoaned over the years how often writers have gone back to centering a story around Spider-Man's kill code, but it normally is one of these very over dramatic things where it's a house of cards that's falling or a series of dominoes that have lined up to put Peter in a position to test how psychotically he can cling to the idea of not killing someone, you know,
right.
Like Maximum Carnage, right? The whole city is being murdered by this alien symbiote, and Peter just cannot allow someone to kill it. And in those instances, Spider-Man looks like an idiot. And I would encourage any team writing this book to just not put him in those scenarios. You don't have to put him in those scenarios. You're the one that's writing those scenarios to make him look dumb, you know?
For sure.
And, you know, maybe every once in a while. But, like, I know Dan Slott leaned on this constantly and sometimes in really interesting ways. Like, I think you and I talked about the 2-part, like, No One Dies and really liked that. But to me, this making it such a, like, thing that's tied to his empathy and not, like, making it something that is so, like attributable to, like, this thing is going to hurt all of my friends. It's a small moment of empathy between Peter and this man where he says, actually, like, I didn't realize how human you were. I can't kill you now. And I will help you out. It reminds me a lot of, like, what was done in No Way Home, where that Spider-Man realizes, I can't let these guys go die. You know, like, if I can do anything, I will. And so it didn't go out of its way. It was naturally built into the plot of Spider-Man having a realization about his kill code. And I thought it was really touching, like, you know, because it's about Spider-Man's empathy at the very core. What did you think about this particular story around this salesman, I guess?
Cashier, whatever you want to call him.
Yeah.
I mean, no, I agree with all of that, and actually, what I felt was the most effective demonstration of it was actually following the guy's death, because it was like, you know, we open the whole comic with this monologue of Peter, you know, fighting these vampires and kind of being like, yep, this is black and white. I love it. You know what I mean? and following the realization that these monsters that he's fighting are just people who've been turned. Some of them, you know, very unwillingly. You know, like we have that inner monologue, and the line that got me the best from this was like that nothing feels good. You know what I mean? Like he's now, it's like he's going through the motions, because like even he's not saving anybody. You know, like and I think like for Peter that is always where the trauma of him as Spider-Man cuts him deepest, when he feels like he's actually not making a difference. You know what I mean? Like it's like what's his who is his responsibility to at this point? You know what I mean? It's like I can stop the vampires, but they're people. You know, like these are people. Right. And so it was very like as you alluded to, this wasn't like the sledgehammer of plot, like I must not kill, and I think because it was just like this like very visceral reaction, very authentic reaction from Peter here in terms of the arc of him coming around on these vampires, it had a real emotional impact, and was quite effective in that regard.
The line that got me was, who were these monsters yesterday?
Yeah.
Which might as well be a question asked all throughout the history of Spider-Man. Like, that's kind of like the question to ask about any Spider-Man villain is like, who was this guy before whatever happened, you know, that made them this way, you know? Villains that I think best kind of like signify that are like Sandman, maybe even like Harry Osborn, you know, like what, like, you know, who were these monsters before they were monsters? And to me, when I talked earlier about this being something special, at least to me, I think that's what made it special for me, is that like it used this event thing to tell this simple Spider-Man story, but I don't know that many have asked as essential a question in such an elegant way for me, you know, about these characters, and in a way that like, I mean, that could be really hammy, but I think it's actually not. It's actually really quite like touching in a way. It's like everybody I fight was someone before. And to me, like that is the essence of Spider-Man. And so, you know, to me, that's what elevated the story beyond like the standard platonic ideal of a Spider-Man comic is it had something to say about the history of the character, and isn't completely one-sided about it, because like, yeah, he's showing some humanity towards these vampires, right? But he also showed humanity towards Kareem and White Rabbit, and what ended up happening here. Somebody died, you know?
Yeah.
And so like Spider-Man learning about like where he extends his empathy is a lesson maybe he'll eternally be learning, but it's all baked into this story here.
Yeah, I guess, you know, not to be somewhat nihilistic here, but I guess like what kind of holds me back from like really wanting to embrace this story is, I mean, you know, you had mentioned a few seconds ago about like, you know, what this comic says about Spider-Man, and like, you know, one of my big complaints about not even just this run, but I feel like several runs over the last decade has been like, you know, and I've said these exact words. It's like, what are we actually trying to say? And what is this creator actually trying to say about Spider-Man here? Like, I feel like, you know, every
do you
creator...
feel like it's that he's easily duped?
Well, no, hear me out here.
Sure.
It's more that I think this, more than almost any other comic that we've gotten during this run, is trying to say something about Spider-Man. And my concern is, and like, look, this is, I'm projecting here, so like you gotta forgive me, but like I also don't think I'm gonna be proven wrong here, is that I don't feel like what we're trying to say here is gonna actually amount to anything when it's all said and done, because I feel like eventually the book is going to get distracted by some other kind of shiny thing. And I think that's what's so frustrating right now. You know what I mean? It's like, man, if we could just get comics around what we're trying to get at here, because yeah, is it that he's duped? Is he that he's too trusting? Is he, you know, like, does he let responsibility, the oath to responsibility lead him to a point where, you know, he can maybe make things worse because he's not, you know, he's being tunnel visioned about it, you know, like, those are interesting things to say about Spider-Man. Those are, you know, like the thing, even not to go totally tangential here, but like, you know, even with like the Free Comic Book Day and the stuff with like Norman Osborn, it's like, I keep saying to myself, man, like this whole Peter Norman friendship, like there's so much they could have done here, and they really didn't, you know? Like,
yeah.
Like, and it's like, it's the same thing here. It's like, man, there's a lot we can do with here, and yet we really haven't seen this consistently throughout this run. And based on like what's on the horizon, based on solicitations, I don't think we're going to see more of that. So it's like, do you just hold on to, yeah, but this was a really good issue, and this was a really good storyline. I mean, you know, World Without Love was excellent. It's one of my favorite stories that we've gotten over the last decade. Is what said there actually, you know, I guess it's how you read comics over the longevity of a creative run, you know, and I'm getting very existential here, but the fact that so that's where I'm just kind of like, you know, like I want to like this more, but like, are we really going to explore these themes some more? And I don't think they are. So it's like I kind of don't want to get too attached to it. You know what I mean? So I don't know.
I'm going to push back on that, Mark, which is we just started this conversation by saying like, oh, this like is a part of the Tombstone story arc, and about like how Spider-Man extended his empathy and keeps getting duped by these guys. You know, like,
no, you're right.
I guess we're waiting for the third act of that story to play out. You know, but like I don't like. I mean. Again, we don't know what's going to happen there, but I don't think this is so divergent from the themes that have come before. Like, if you were laying that on the feet of, like, how Jackpot's story has been told, I would agree with you 100%. Like, I have defended that idea, and so does the back of this letters page. I don't know if you don't read the letters page, but there was someone who wrote in about Jackpot.
Was it you?
No, it was not me.
Okay.
For once, yeah, unless I have several aliases. Which is basically the Slack. But like someone wrote in about like, oh, you know, it's really inappropriate to like put Mary Jane as Jackpot, and it feels really out of character. Why did you want to do this? And Nick Lowe writes back, he's like, look, there's been a lot of stories about her not as a superhero, and there will be a ton more later with her not as a superhero, but we thought it might be fun to see what it's like to make Mary Jane a superhero for a short bit. And like, in my heart of hearts, I'm like, cool. Like that's okay. Like you can do
comics.
things with characters. Yeah, exactly. But when you do them half-assed without your like full attention on it, and you take a major character like Mary Jane and you just kind of go like, whatever, like we'll release a one shot and maybe it'll be going on in the background with very little work put into it. That's when things begin to fall apart. And I'm probably the biggest defender of that status quo on the internet.
Right.
Because I actually think that Zeb has done a couple interesting things with it, while also thinking it's been poorly done overall. So But I think this particular storyline about Spider-Man extending his empathy to Tombstone, his gang, and all that stuff is very much something that Zeb has put at the forefront of his run. And so I'm going to push back on you on that one. Yeah.
All right. I'm not disagreeing with that. So, anyway, you win. You win, Dan.
I mean, I don't have to win. I'm just gonna push back. All right, Mark. This has been a great discussion about the issue. We obviously have more to say about it in a moment, but in the meantime, Mark, if people wanted to like read more of our work on Spider-Man, what could they do?
Read about Spider-Man in this economy, Dan? Well, you could go to amazingspidertalk.substack and check out our Substack. That is our free newsletter that comes out somewhat regularly. We're going to have a new issue this week, guys. So that's number one. And this week's issue is going to be all about the free Comic Book Day comic book that we got last week. It's going to have Ultimate Spider-Man number 4. Everyone loves Ultimate Spider-Man except for Dan. Dan doesn't not love it, but he doesn't love it as much as everyone else, so thus everyone thinks he doesn't like it, because that's how you do comic criticism in 2024. You either
Mark is like really getting into the meta fiction of the show, which is like Dan is positive on Ultimate Spider-Man. He likes it. Therefore, he hates it.
Therefore, he hates it. I mean, look, I only see what I see on X, Dan, and that's what people say.
Well, that's the only comic that's not being put out by Nick Lowe's Spider Office that has Spider-Man in it. So therefore, because I'm a Nick Lowe shill, I clearly can't like Ultimate Spider-Man. This is what goes on social media, people. If you want to read my actual, I think, fairly nuanced take on Ultimate Spider-Man and where I am hoping for it to go, or like what questions I wanted to answer, check out that Substack. It's going to be a good one this week, and you can follow it by going to amazingspider.substack.com, or there's a link in the description to this podcast. You just click on the link, go right in. It'll ask you to subscribe, and hey, what could it hurt? You're already spent half your day deleting emails anyway. So come join our Substack. Yeah. Just one more to delete. No, you're going to read it, of course.
You're going to love it, people. You got my guarantee on it. You know, I'm like the Men's Warehouse people. My guarantee, I don't know. I'm really
it'll fit you like a glove. Anyway, let's talk about some of the art.
Like an OJ isotone. Anyway.
If the Substack fits, you must quit. Anyway, let's talk about JR on art. What'd you think, Mark?
It's after not having JR for a handful of issues, it was certainly quite enjoyable to have him back. It wasn't anything super splashy about this. As I alluded to, his White Rabbit as a vampire looked good. Sorry. I mean, look, come on.
Learning a lot about you, Mark.
Series that has Black Hat. All right, whatever, man. Who among us? But anyway, no, it was good. It was good stuff. I mean, it wasn't his greatest, but it was good. It was solid JR art. I love seeing him.
I enjoy seeing him do what I don't know if I would call this a horror comic, and I don't know if his style really could ever really terrify me. But he filled the backgrounds of this with these hard vertical lines and horizontal lines to fill in the darkness that I guess could have been painted black or with flat black inks. But it adds a lot of volume and grit to this and weight to the pages that I really liked. And there were these series of intense close-ups during the tearful speech from the Vampire Man. which I thought was nicely paced to allow Zeb to kind of write his story in there. And, the thing I'm going to keep saying about JR is that, like, he is the king of, like, staging action and dialogue. There's that image of the tall panel of Peter standing with the stake over the man that, like, emphasizes, like, the position of power that Peter is in over this weak figure. And you know what? For a book that's kind of scary, it was also kind of funny. Like, there's a sort of physical comedy to this of, like, White Rabbit, bouncing off the walls. And my favorite image, I think, in this issue was Peter upside down, poking his head through the door with the stake in his hand. There's something kind of, like, wimpy about that I thought was kind of funny. Like, a guy who's being, like, overly cautious to not get bit by this vampire, but doing it in a uniquely Spider-Man way. I think a lot of, like artists forget of, like, some of the unique visual ways they can utilize Spider-Man and just have him walking around like a dude when really he should be walking on the ceiling and doing all of these other things. And JR never forgets any of that stuff. He utilizes it all. And like you said, this is a confined in a hallway and 2 room story, but I still think JR does as much as he can with it in terms of, like, pacing and geography and physical character acting. I'll never look at JR and take him for granted. I'll say that.
Oh, 100%. And what did you think of Menyz's colors here?
I mean, I think he's really amazing just generally. I know there's that Twitter meme that seems to be going around about, like, oh, it would all be better if it was flat colors and Menyz is ruining it. But, like, I'm sick of that stuff. Menyz, I think, is, like, the best colorist we've had in ages, and having him back in after the past 2 colorists, like, which is not knocks Sonia Obak, but, like, I think Menyz is just, like, top class. And even down to the effects he adds, I imagine it's him adding the effects, like the blur on White Rabbit's face when she's trying to chomp Spider-Man's neck. It's like the teeth are left sharp, but the rest of her is blurred, and so it makes it extra, like, snappy and, like, serious in the way that she's trying to bite him. I mean, it's little things like that elevate the motion and flow of the comic, even if there's not really many colors in this issue. It's a lot of darkness, and that little bit of light that Menyz paints coming in through the window that kind of, like, rim lights all the characters is just a nice touch to, like, punctuate the scene. Yeah. Did you have any thoughts on Menyz, or am I covering most of it?
I think you covered most of it. Menyz is good.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay. That's my astute thing.
Let me see if you can pitch in here, Mark, because as much as I love this comic, there's one bit that I'm like, did I miss something? And maybe it's a fundamental misunderstanding of the Marvel universe and how vampires work. Like, I've been reading all the stuff that's been leading up to this blood hunt in, like, Avengers was doing a lot of stuff with, like, the vampires for a while. And I know the great current Blade book is doing a lot with Dracula and Blade teaming up, which may or may not play out across Blood Hunt. I know you haven't read the first issue, so I don't want to spoil it for you. And that's been a really good title if people aren't reading Blade. But there's a moment in this where Spider-Man is creeping through it, and the man who's tied up says something like, stop calling me or a monster. And Peter's, like, thinks to himself, I'm not saying this out loud, am I? Oh, I happen to really like vampires, like a sort of corrective, like, the vampire's reading his mind. Can vampires read people's minds in the Marvel universe, Mark?
I admittedly the kind of monster book section of Marvel is kind of a blind spot to me. I mean, I've read some, like, old school Doctor Strange, like post Ditko, and I know that there's some, like, overlay with, like, Blade and monsters and stuff like that, but, like, the short answer is I don't know, Dan. And like like vampire mythology in general is kind of confusing to me, because I feel like there's a lot of leeway in terms of what a vampire can do and how much power or control it has over its victims and things like that. So
Sure, right. Vampires can put people into trances and things like that, right?
Like glamour them or whatever.
Sure.
Yeah.
Like
So
sparkly diamond Twilight style, even.
I mean, I was thinking more True Blood, but yeah, I mean, whatever your garbage pop culture is.
I guess the better question to ask you, Mark, is that how you read that scene? That it was like reading his mind in some way, or that maybe like, because I was trying to reread it as if like maybe it was supposed to be a tip off that, Kareem had already been in that room, even though we saw it at the beginning of the book where he goes in and sees him chained up and White Rabbit in there. But like, I couldn't recontextualize it, why he would be saying, "Don't call me a monster" or something like that. Maybe he's talking to himself. Like, what was your read on that?
I mean, if I said I didn't think that deeply about it, are you going to get upset with me, Dan?
No. It's just a weird beat in the story, like that Spider-Man changes his narration because he feels like someone's listening to his mind.
Yeah. I mean, I'm taking it as a mind reading the way you're describing it, and now that I'm thinking back to it, I'm like, oh yeah, I guess it was more like, someone's in my head. But I don't know if those are the rules or not. So, shrug, I guess. I don't know.
I also bring it up because there's like something we haven't really talked about on the show. Like, we know we have the Spider Goblin story coming up from the solicits, and obviously that's a bit unfair to talk about, what's in the future necessarily, but they are advertising the hell out of it. And there were a couple moments, right? There's the moment with Michelle a couple issues ago where Spider-Man was doing something, when like, and was unaware of it. And then, in the previous issues with the first, Chasm issue we just got recently, when Spider-Man shows up, all the villains say, he's back. And then, Betty goes back, which implies that Spider-Man was there earlier, unless they were mistaking it for Chasm. And then here there's a weird moment where like Spider-Man's like, wait, is that guy reading my mind? Like maybe Spider-Man had already been in that room before and called him a monster. That would be a very weird thing to do. And I'm not going to spoil what happens in issue 50 because I've seen the first few pages of it from solicitations, and there's something there that explains what has been going on. And so like, I wanted to flag this because one, it seemed very odd to me in the pages of the comic, and maybe it ties into something we're going to get in issue 50. But yeah, anyway, just wanted to get your read on it, Mark.
All I'm going to say, Dan, is look out.
I'll never live it down.
Nope.
So
no.
There we go.
So speaking of looking out, what are you looking out for in terms of your grade, Dan, on this comic?
Mark, you were going to say I am hard on the curve, but I'm giving this one an A-.
Okay, I'm. You have talked me up, but I'm not as up as you. I'm going to say B+.
Okay, it's very close, but I appreciate that you were able to feel the spirit of Gavasdan positivity. The only place in my life where I'm positive is on Spider-Man comics. So
there you go.
Nick Lowe, you can send me the money in the mail because we all know I'm always positive on this comic.
Exactly.
Anyway. Mark, why don't you take us home?
Well, I, for one, am positive that it's that time, Dan. Time for all good things to come to an end. So we want to say thank you to you, the listeners and viewers, for tuning into this episode of The Amazing Spider Talk.
Yeah, this podcast exists because of your listener support on Patreon. For only $3.99 a month, you can help support our show's existence while getting early episodes, including these reviews the same weeks the comics release, exclusive artwork, and we've got some awesome stuff coming down the line, and a ton of other bonuses. So thank you again to everyone who already supports us in the work that Mark and I do. But we want to extend a special thanks to our newest contributors, a bunch of them this week: Peter Wisdom, Gabriel Torres, and Robert Cooper. Thanks, everybody, for signing up and supporting us.
Absolutely. Well, Dan and I really want to increase all of the awesome work we do in the second half of 2024. So if you're already a patron or want to become one, please help us to meet our goals and make this a better podcast by considering supporting our show. Just go to amazingspidertalk.com and click on that big Patreon button to get started.
Don't forget to subscribe to our Amazing Spider Talk Substack to keep in the loop with all the things that are going on with our podcast and our extended thoughts about Spider-Man, especially around this anniversary issue that's coming up. It's amazingspider.substack.com. So, Mark, until our eyeballs pop out like ping pong balls, what's our motto?
With great podcasts, there must also come the Amazing Spider Talk.
Don't miss the next installment.
Seems a web, any size.